the internet architecture is distributed, it is decentralized, it is made in a way which empowers the edges rather than the center. And this is a really important angle that we want to take as a consideration in this workshop. And that raises such questions as, can there be human rights online without an open internet? What's the relationship between the two? Is there any mutual influence? And can we go as far as to say that there are shared values between human rights and the open internet model? To finish, I think we have a very good diversity of panelists here, and that reflects the fact that human rights has become a multi-stakeholder issue. And one, again, of the objective of this workshop is to see how we can best work together to foster a rights-based internet. So please let me introduce some of our very distinguished speakers. On my right, Maria Hall, Deputy Director of the Ministry of Enterprise, Energy and Communications from Sweden. Next to her, Subi Chaturvedi. She's an assistant professor at the University of Delhi. Avri Doria is on the far right. Avri is a research consultant and works at .gay LLC. I have over there Emin Mili, who's a writer and activist in Azerbaijan. Joy Lidiquote, Internet Rights Project coordinator at the Association for Progressive Communications. On the other side, Lee Hibbard from the Council of Europe, working in the Information Society and Internet Governance Project. And just in front of me, Teresa Swinehart, who is Executive Director at Verizon. And finally, Marcus Kummer, Vice President for Public Policy at the Internet Society and the moderator of this session. So Marcus, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolas. Yes, we from the Internet Society, as you will know, we provide the institutional home for the Internet Engineering Task Force. And we attach great importance to the work on standards, and open and interoperable standards are the heart of the Internet in a manner to speak. They make it possible to do what we do, as Nicola explained. And we have been in touch with the Association for Progressive Communication, and we thought it would be good to develop a paper that explains the close relationship between Internet standards and human rights. Human rights are, so to speak, part of the DNA of the Internet. They're hardwired into its very core. And that gives me the opportunity to ask Avri to talk about her research, as she was the co-author of the paper I just mentioned. Please, Avri.
Thank you. Yes, so part of this talk is really an introduction to the paper that APC and ISOC, or ISOC and APC, put out. Joy over there was the primary author on it, and I sort of assisted with some of the research and some of the writing, and thus I'm the one to present it. Stepping back a little on this paper, it actually has been a year in the coming. Joy and I were actually sitting on a bus, as so many of you are doing this time, going back and forth between our hotel and the Nairobi meeting. And on that, Joy first explained to me that, you know, RFC 1591 defines the multi-stakeholder process. And I go, what? And she says, yes, if you read, and I said, well, I have read 1591. This is the one that defines how the TLDs need to work and how they are to be governed. And I go, no, I've read it, it doesn't. But then I went back and read it, and indeed, it did define much of what we are calling the multi-stakeholder process. And this was John Postel way back when writing that this is how we should be governing the internet. And then on a later bus ride, we basically sort of started talking about internet protocols and human rights. I was a technologist for most of my career, you know, have written protocols and considered them, and yet had never considered the human rights aspect of a protocol the whole time I was working on them in the IETF. But we started going through them, and we started looking at things like robustness principles, where things could interoperate, and how to be conservative in what you did and accepting, and basically how to work with others. The whole notion of roles and responsibilities, the notion of fairness and non-discrimination. You find these things in IP. You go back and you read IP. You go back and you read the TCP protocol, and you actually see that many of these things, participatory, distribution, all of these things that are fundamental protocol notions inside the internet, inside the pieces that build the internet, were indeed there and are indeed representative of many of the things that now we look at the human rights. So the project became one, and this paper is really just a first step in it, to basically start looking at the internet protocols that make up what we call the internet, and start looking at human rights, both of us being sort of familiar with the other but specialists in one, Joy being the specialist in human rights, and start seeing how we could start mapping the concepts we find in one and the concepts we find in the other. We looked both at the protocols that dictate the operation of the internet. Specifically, we stayed with IP and TCP, though I have a long list in a table of other protocols that I really want to take a look at some point, and see whether those protocols contribute further towards this human rights essential nature of the internet. But as we looked more and more, we really became convinced, and this is where we did not start out with the notion of human rights being in the DNA of the internet, and I think that that's probably a phrase that belongs to Marcus, because it wouldn't have occurred to me. But as you start to look at, you see, it really is fundamental. And, you know, I can't speak for the people that wrote IP and TCP. We could probably go ask Vint at some point whether he was thinking of human rights, but I doubt it. It was just sort of a notion of, well, of course it's what you do when you're building a protocol, when things are enacting. You want a protocol that allows anybody to talk to anyone at any time, anywhere. And once you start breaking down what that means in terms of freedom of expression, freedom of association, I can associate with anyone, anytime, and other freedoms, you see that the protocol essentially is creating a network wherein those things are actually built. Now, one of the things we didn't take in this paper is go too far into looking at what happens if you start reducing those aspects of the protocol. What happens if you filter? What happens if you don't? Those are assumptions, those are conclusions that people can perhaps come to later. Another part of the problem that we looked at, or the issue that we looked at, was, is there anything in the processes that are similar? Is there anything in the multi-stakeholder process that created the internet and is now being used in this forum to try and discuss governance? Is there anything essential in that with human rights? And we saw some similarities, but there we saw some differences and what we call discontinuities in terms of how indeed the rights were not developed, but understood and described, and the roles and responsibilities defined. So where we're at on this paper, and this is one of the reasons why we're having this discussion, is we put out a working draft of that paper, and someone can probably point you all to the URL. I don't have it at the moment. I don't know how many of you had a chance to read it before coming here, but basically we're looking to take it further. We're looking for comments. We're looking for people that see what we wrote, you know, see if the conclusions that we start to, the things we start to point out, make any sense to you. that when we look at RFCs, we see a rule of law, a due process, impartiality, neutrality. We see stewardship and duties rather than rights. We see fairness, we see non-discrimination, we see democratic participatory processes, accountability for performance, freedom of information, expression, the free flow of information, freedom of association, and freedom for those operating in various subparts. We see the notion of subsidiarity. It's not a human right, perhaps, but we see those notions built into the protocols. And this one paper is sort of the beginning of starting to look at that. And it becomes important, because if we're sort of saying, mess with the internet and you're messing with our human rights, to be able to go back to these protocols and say, and really, here it is in black and white, that the internet is based upon these principles, and if you transgress these principles, if you harm the protocols, you're actually harming the human rights of the people that use the internet. So that's the thesis. The paper is the beginning of the argument. We'd like you all to read it, comment, get back to us, and I think the discussion is going to sort of move on from here, looking at some of those notions. So I think that's it for me introducing the paper, and thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent introduction and a very good commercial for our paper, which we hope we'll be able to issue on the annual Human Rights Day in December. And to pick up on what you said, I tend to agree with you that the windsurfs and Bob Kahns of this world didn't sit down and think, let's write a protocol about human rights. But at the same time, I heard them say quite a lot that it came sort of out of the 60s movement and also in America, civil liberties and the whole race question. So, I mean, there was a big movement in the 60s in favor of all these values, and obviously human rights are a very strong part of that, and all the IETF processes are very strong on these notions. But now we go over to our next speaker, Subi Chaturvedi from Delhi University. It's Subi's first time at the IGF, and she will present us a perspective from a very big country. Please, Subi.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you, Marcus, for giving me this opportunity. I have this very daunting task before me of trying to give you an Indian position. My first challenge really is there is no one India. So this is a country that lives and exists across 3 centuries. This is a country, before I even get into the question of access, I must absolutely bring in diversity. I know Nicholas was kind enough to introduce me to you as someone who engages with academia. I also run a foundation called Media for Change, which has helped me inform my perspective on India by engaging with youth and women. And I'm a documentary filmmaker. My last project was a film on freedom of speech and expression in India and what the contemporary issues are that we are facing today. So that is where my interventions are going to come in from. Just to give you some numbers, we have about 750 dialects, about 18 languages that are recognized by the Constitution of India. There's a currency note that carries about 15 scripts, and we have $5 billion homes, and we have slums which border those homes. We also have the existence of about 700 million active mobile telephones and about 125 million internet users. Now, the challenge really is how do you make sure that you reconcile the interest of several extremely fragmented, extremely disjointed stakeholders into the concept of one India? Because it is, as a notion, it exists. So one of the four unifying factors that we've been able to look at are clearly telegraph and post, the Indian railways, are the Indian movies, which and I've had this fantastic experience of getting into taxis, Marcus, and I've had a cab driver singing to me songs from the 70s. That was even before my time, before I even walked the planet, and they're absolutely thrilled that I come from this country. So it's been a great unifying factor, and some of us would argue the other constituency is cricket. That's the only thing that gets us together and going like nothing. But one of the things that has also happened for us is the idea of mobile telephony, and that has then translated into the internet. As far as penetration is concerned, we have a long way to go, but our issues in terms of what the internet has been able to do, and that brings me to the first question that has been really posed for us here today, is the idea of freedom. Can there be one concept of freedom across platforms? In India, clearly, it's been about capabilities and choices, and Professor Amartya Sen has argued that you cannot have a society that's been largely agricultural to automatically move into a society that's technology-based. So our biggest challenge is the Indian government, through the USO fund, where each mobile user contributes about 5% of their bill into the fund for the spread of the fiber optic cable network, which is now going to be connecting about 250,000 village local self-governance through mobile telephone subscribers and their contribution, which is spreading the internet forward. So one of the things that we've been able to do is we've been able to innovate at a very decentralized level in terms of policy making. So that's been one advantage. How do I link that to the basic grain and fabric of the internet and the question of human rights? There are certain key intrinsic characteristics that the internet brings with them, and one of them is openness, the other is permissionless innovation, the third would be modularity, and the fifth is the ability to come together as disparate units. I think a lot of civil society and academia inputs have a lot to learn from the way this format has played out. The fact that you can pick on a cause, the fact that you can articulate choices. We have different regions and there are special laws for different parts of the country. We've recently had one of the biggest ethnic conflicts, and new media and social media have played a large role, according to the government perspective, in escalating that conflict. So one of our first reactions was, there's a foreign hand, let's blame it there. And the other reaction was, this is all evil. So what we need to do in the guise of protecting vulnerable communities, be it women and children, or I'm really talking from the margins of the marginalized. The first very convenient action on a government's perspectives is to get into takedowns, blockages. I know about 314 profiles that were blocked because they were supposedly threatening the fabric and the constitution of this great democracy. Out of that, I know for a fact that there were senior journalists who were actually advocating and merely sharing those images and telling us that this is something that is clearly photoshopped and cannot be true. But the way systems work, and in the Indian constitution, there is no particular right that recognizes freedom of speech and expression. The Constitution recognizes the right of freedom for the Indian citizens. So there are no special laws for either the internet or the press or the media or any other communication vehicle. This is the Article 19, and the Article 19A, which talks about certain reasonable restrictions to that freedom of speech and expression, talks about certain very esoteric, very arbitrary things like harming the national fabric, hurting religious sentiments, and also the idea that you could possibly be disturbing friendly neighborhood relationships. Now, how do you possibly do that? And what do you do? So can there be a positive obligation on the part of the government to actually engage and use the same medium and not pose that as a threat? Questions 2 and 3 talk about policy and how the idea of openness cannot be at odds. I do not think that it is possible, remotely possible, to say that anything that promotes dialogue or is a platform, it's like saying I have a gun and it's a tool. Guns don't kill people. People kill people. So if you're looking at, and there was, the first reaction was to instruct telcos to restrict the number of SMSs that were being sent out. In the case of the ethnic violence to 5. So the idea of trust, the idea of reaching out and building platforms is something that's completely mitigated to a corner. And what we do is we create this blank space where you cannot reach out to anyone. I do not think that's could possibly be the best way forward for any community as far as engaging on the subject of human rights and engaging with each stakeholder in the internet ecosystem. I think that is something that the internet does at a very fundamental level. So student communities, especially from regions which have been in conflict, and there are many in India, be it Kashmir, be it the Northeast, the voices which are not heard, which are not represented, they are the ones who've been able to articulate and reach out. There are pages on Facebook which exist, which have about several thousand likes, and for India, numbers are easy. That's the one thing that we're good at. You have you want a show of hands, you want a public referendum, we can get that for you anytime. But what is our concern? Our concern is the lack of research. Our concern is, and which is why I tremendously appreciate Ivory taking that time and putting together a paper, because for any industry or any movement, it's imperative that we introspect, we take 2 steps back, and we consolidate our positions, and we find ways of disseminating them. Marcus mentioned it's been my first IGF really, and I'm overwhelmed and so grateful that this has been a platform, and such a great enabling platform that it's been able to put me in touch with parts of the world where we do fantastic events. We do national IGFs once a year. But if we were to only look at that platform, then I think it would take another 200 years for every country to get an opportunity to do an IGF. So what I am proposing is an internet freedom movement. We've had the Occupy Wall Street, we've had the Arab Spring, we've had a bit of an Indian summer. So in terms of engagement of human rights and internet, if we could look at sustained platforms, we could look at a series of events which would sustain conversations and dialogues and create spaces for dissemination. I do not think for 1 minute that we could possibly have a situation where a medium could be threatening or harming openness. And this is one tool, at least in the Indian situation, which has been hugely empowering in every which way possible. One of the things that has happened is it has created a new constituency, which is the prosumer. So you had the producer and you had the consumer. The amount of phenomenal user-generated content that we've seen, the amount of public, and there have been 4 specific instances. Salman Rushdie's book, he was supposed to come to the Jaipur Literary Festival and present his book and have a discussion, a conversation. There are certain fundamental groups that came in and he could not make his presentation. He then offered to make a presentation through a video link. Even that was disallowed. This conversation then went online, and there was so much public pressure that is that an indication? Yes. So I'll just make very quick Twitter interventions. There was another controversy that flowed out on the internet. This was a senior professor who shared a cartoon, and he was then taken to jail and ambushed and made to apologize. There have been several instances where freedom is at stake. But what has been amazing and what has been important is the fact that we've been able to multiply, we've been able to create change agents, and we've been able to tell the story. And I'm just going to end my interventions here. We recently put together the India IGF, which had about 475 participants from across the world, across 5 multi-stakeholder groups, and about 15 international speakers. One of the things that we managed to do was reach out to the youth. So out of the two days, we had a whole half-day session that was dedicated to youth debates, which included students from all over. And we managed to involve them in every process of the MAG. These are our multipliers. Civil society ran across with 5 sessions. So all that we're saying is there's this trend that we've experienced that it's easy to blame the industry or the private sector, but it's very, very convenient to step back and say not enough is happening. How do we get there? So just one last thought, that we have to keep knocking on the doors and not give up, because this is something that's precious to all of us, and this is something that we've engaged in for a very long time. So I think it's a good fight and it's worth fighting it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I was in a workshop on intellectual property this morning, and there was obviously a lot of talk about acta sopa pipa.
Yes.
And there was talk about knocking on the doors. I mean, it's clearly the internet community has woken up. You have noticed we had slightly changed the speakers. We have different speakers. Some of them could not make it. We had 2 speakers originally from Sweden, but neither Johan could make it from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, nor Patrick Fallström. He's not here, but instead we have Maria. So please give a Swedish perspective.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for Patrick Fallström who couldn't be here, of course, because I'm delighted to be here, and I'm also sorry for my colleague Mr. Johan Hallenborg from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who couldn't be here, but he's in another panel, so I'm happy to be able to talk on his behalf and see the Swedish perspective. Actually, because I'm working for the Ministry of Enterprise, Energy and Communication, my view on what is an open internet is a little bit different than Johan's. Actually, it was a little bit different than Johan's, but we have been working so closely between the Ministry of Enterprise and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for several years by now, so we are actually coming together in a very, very mutual and strong understanding how important it is, both for innovation and growth and competition, which are my areas, and also the open internet important for human rights. And in the beginning, when we started to work together some years back, actually the internet-related discussions was mostly taking part actually on the Ministry of Enterprise in a very infrastructure technical perspective. But then suddenly, when I was going to various meetings and so on, I started to realize that people are talking about human rights and internet and the open internet in another perspective that I was used to. So I called my friend Johan, whom I didn't know so well by then, by the way, and I said, okay, you have to come and help me here, because these are issues actually I'm not aware of it. I'm not an expert in this kind of areas. So that is the way it started. So then by now it's been this kind of way of working and having this shared understanding on open internet, of course, is spreading. I mean, it's not only me and you working with this right now. It's many other ministries and many other individuals at our ministries are actually having a lot of collaboration. And actually, what we saw in the beginning was how strong we were together, that we could actually fight for an open internet out of 2 strong platforms, both the human rights platforms and also about the innovation and growth and competition. But what we see now is not only that we are so strong together with these 2 important policy areas, we also see how dependent those 2 areas are to each other, actually. I mean, one is the condition for the human rights, of course, they have to have good innovation and growth and also good competition, but also vice versa. Actually, another thing that we are talking about a lot in Sweden, which I hope that we could actually maybe not sort out, but maybe we can have I can have other perspective than my own, is actually what is very related to the Ministry of Enterprise, Energy and Communication discussions is about net neutrality. So what we're trying to explore now in Sweden, actually, does net neutrality per se, does it have any human rights implications? And also, actually, which Nicholas was saying here in the beginning, does actually is an open internet. Can we have human rights without an open internet? Is that possible? And of course, the gut feeling is like, no, of course you can't have human rights if you don't have an open internet. But if you start analyzing that a little bit and you reflect on the net neutrality discussion, what do you mean with an open internet? Could it be like a business model oriented thing that, you know, certain service providers or telecommunication operators are actually, well, maybe not blocking, but maybe prioritizing the traffic in certain ways, and that might be interpreted as not really open, and that, of course, that debate is going on about the net neutrality. But is that violating human rights? That is a very good question. I'm supposed to have a lot of answers and a lot of that needs to be analyzed more. But another way of seeing open internet is actually when states are actually blocking content or violating individuals. That's another perspective on the open internet. So I think that the discussion today with my fellows here and also you in the room will be very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And yes, Sweden has great merits in really pushing this issue on the international agenda. In the Human Rights Council started talking about the internet and adopted resolution and recognizing that online the human rights should be as respected as offline. And Sweden has always taken the line we also take, that online and offline should be treated the same way to the extent possible. But let's not, well, basically our plan was to have as an interactive discussion as possible, and I'm looking now at Joy. She was basically very much at the beginning of that paper we've been talking about, and would maybe also listen from you what you see as main challenges going forward, or whatever. Oh, microphone. Nicola, can you? You have to be the room moderator and run around with the microphone.
He's not in heels.
Is that working? Is that working? Yes, thank you. Thanks, Marcus and to ISOC for being willing to convene this panel, and Avri, both for the bus ride conversation and the excellent introduction to the paper. I think that one of the interesting avenues or reasons to explore this concept in a multi-stakeholder environment, particularly for me, has been the possibility for collaboration with the technical community. And I think that in a multi-stakeholder environment, we can forget sometimes to weight equally the inputs of all stakeholders. And I very strongly think the technical community has a significant contribution to make to the human rights discussion in relation to the internet. And indeed, it seemed to us in working through some of the concepts of this paper that, in fact, often the technical community are our frontline human rights defenders in securing and keeping open the internet, because I'm not a technical person. I didn't even know what an RFC was until a few years ago, or what an internet protocol was. And I'm totally dependent, or was, on the technical community to guide, shape, explain, and contribute to understanding for human rights activists what are the technical implications of changes to or interference with technical operation of the internet. So I see this as very much a shared conversation, and an important one in terms of expanding those people we think of as human rights defenders, those people who are able to see human rights issues. I think another sort of core aspect, and something that very much struck us in this research, which we would like views about, is that hardwired into the human rights themselves are also some similar principles to that which on which the internet functions. For example, that human rights belong to the end users. It's not governments which have rights. Governments have obligations to secure and uphold and protect rights, and that rights are their most powerful when the end users and at the edges of the human rights systems, we are empowered ourselves. And this seemed a very core shared value with the very operation of the internet itself that was worth exploring. And indeed also in Article 19, as Sebi has mentioned, the free flow of information, the idea that as humans we would communicate with each other, unmediated by governments unless in clear circumstances. So I suppose a question that then raises is, if we see the internet being taken up so rapidly, so vastly, in some ways it's being taken up faster than human rights in some places. And again, what is it then that the technical community is bringing to human rights that we may not see if we look at human rights only from the point of view of what it gives the internet? So, I mean, I can give more introductory remarks, but I very much wanted to emphasize our desire for working with technical community on this idea of shared values, the principles of non-discrimination, equality, freedom of information, the right to free flow of information, which are core fundamental human principles. One other thing I would just remark on, the prescience of the engineers who wrote the RFCs, in many that we sometimes have to deal with. And I think that also speaks to the multi-stakeholder way in which they were shaped, which in terms of the openness of the Internet Engineering Task Force as a platform for standards creation. And I think this is an interesting counterpoint when we see something like the SOPA-PIPA proposals, where multi-stakeholder groups, including the technical community, very strongly arguing for multi-stakeholder assessment of those human rights interferences. So with those, perhaps just brief remarks, I'm happy to also pass the microphone and share with others. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like now to turn to Lee. He is from the Council of Europe, an organization that does not have a technological background, but has a very strong human rights and democracy background. Lee, give us your take.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I find it's very interesting, this discussion and the paper also because often you find that when people who do, let's say, human rights policy don't necessarily know always the deep, dark details of the technical side. It's very difficult to bring the two together. So bringing them together here is very, for me, very useful and very necessary. So thank you. I think we're grappling with change. I think we're in a change period for sure. People talk a lot about this being an exciting time, a time of, not going back. I mean, just look around at the court decisions across the world regarding internet content. There's no uniformity there. There's all sorts of decisions being made by all sorts of judges, based upon all sorts of laws and jurisdictions. It's quite clear we don't fully understand the internet, the freedom on the internet. And I think this paper, for example, is a nice mix between technical and policy, and reveals some of the similarities, perhaps. We did a paper for the GAC, the Governmental Advisory Committee, recently on new GTLDs and freedom of expression and freedom of association, and Joy was one of the authors. And that's a step towards one of the things I think we need to do here is to try to create greater appreciation of internet freedom at the different layers. And so, I mean, one of the things in that paper talks about, for example, that it's important with regards to sensitive new GTLDs to give preference to upholding the right to free expression and freedom of association first, and in parallel, managing any risks associated to the DNS at the same time, but not affecting freedom of expression. So, these things take time, and I think one of the things that we need to do with this work, this ongoing work, is to create bridges. We must create bridges between the decision makers, the judges, the policy makers, to ensure that we can protect and preserve the internet in the future. I don't think laws necessarily reflect the nuances we're talking about today. And technology is fast and law is catching up, but that's our job. We understand that the internet is a catalyst for human rights. That's very clear. We understand that in the Council of Europe. We are all recognizing the power of the internet. We know, we know it's very important. We feel it's very important. Some of us talk about it as being the oxygen for many people who probably have more freedom online than offline sometimes. And so, several years ago in the IGF, when it first started, I think some said that human rights had been done. I said this before, and then we arrived to 7 years later here, and there are more human rights workshops on the IGF agenda than ever before, I would say. I just looked through the list today, and it's just human rights events. It's great, but it's quite revealing where we are. And for people in general, bloggers, safety of journalists, we had an event on that. It's quite clear that it's a source, a freedom for economic growth you mentioned. ACTA is a very revealing movement about why the internet is atypical and represents a freedom which maybe we don't fully understand. That's why when we talk about cutting access to the internet for copyright violations, for example, or blanket cutting of YouTube, that's a case before the Court of Human Rights at the moment. We will see very soon how the interface between the internet, the technical side, and human rights will pan out. We've been very busy at the Council for a few years now, trying to map out, look at the technical things, but map out how human rights and the internet fit together. And a lot's already been done. So, we've already, member states, the Council of Europe member states, 47, have already adopted texts. Some of you know them, and principles which talk about the universality of the internet, not to adversely affect the unimpeded flow of transboundary internet traffic. That's a principle adopted. The integrity of the internet, making sure it's ongoing, that the infrastructure is not affected, that it's decentralized, the things that you've mentioned, that there are open standards, interoperability, that there's an open network, that we have net neutrality in many respects, that people have the greatest choice of access to content and services, and that any traffic management measures are limited and narrowly circumscribed. So we have those adopted principles. States are at least adopting those things. Whether they're implemented is another matter. But there's much out there which needs to be thought about. Do no transboundary harm to the internet when things go across borders. And there's also case law of the court. I mean, I'm thinking about Maria. There's a case in Sweden we've maybe spoken about, whereby you have two private parties. I mentioned this yesterday. A family which was evicted from their apartment because they had put a satellite dish up outside. That was refused. They put it up inside the apartment. That was not allowed, so they were evicted for some reason. But the case eventually came to the Court of Human Rights, and it was thought that these people had a right to receive information on a satellite. Okay, it's not the internet, but on a satellite, the right to receive information, news from their country. Even entertainment and culture was mentioned. So, if you like, that was considered to be a violation of freedom of expression, the right to receive information, access to information. So, that's where we are. I mean, we are applying human rights on the internet. That's happening. And one of the things I think which is coming through very clearly is that we need to protect the internet intermediaries. I mean, freedom first, before you start talking about regulation at all. And I think that what's happening, and this is something which hasn't really come to fruition yet, and I think we're close to that, is that in the 1960s, we went from freedom of expression to an understanding that media freedom was a corollary, was part of freedom of expression. It was part of that right. And I think we're coming to a point soon whereby internet freedom is a corollary of media freedom, which is a corollary to the right to freedom of expression and access to information. I think we're not far. So that said, I think we need to. I think the last thing I'd like to say, and I'll stop there, is to say that the thing we're not doing is putting these things together. We're not. It's very difficult to fit these notions, these principles, these rights, and the technical side together. It's not easy. It will take time. But I am very conscious that something said yesterday by a speaker was that offline, this duality is not going to last for much longer. And we're going to be left with online. So what does that mean for human rights? What does that mean for internet freedom? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. I mean, you mentioned the role of intermediaries. We share very much your position as internet society, and we defend that position in international organizations we engage in. And when you compare it to the offline world, nobody holds the post office responsible for letters that are sent through the post office. But when it comes to the internet, there's a tendency by the very same governments to do it just because it's technologically feasible. But you teed also off can we move on? I teed off the question of freedom of bloggers and journalists, and we have one of them here. Emin Milli, we would like to listen from you, have your perspective. Oh, is it?
Thank you very much. So unless someone gives you access to microphone, yeah, you may have right to express yourself, but nobody will hear you. So it's really important. I think this exercise has shown that someone had to go to take microphone and to give it to you. So I think it's the same and similar with human rights online. I think we have interesting case. I try to nail this, to coin this word, autocracy 2.0. And I want really to, I know we have some journalists here and some people from academia, to look really to take up this case of Azerbaijan and to make it a case study, because Azerbaijan, it's not North Korea, it's not Iran, it's not even China. president says internet is free in Azerbaijan. We are a member of the Council of Europe, but yet we have bloggers jailed, journalists jailed, and people are free to use internet, but the state and the government, government officials feel also free to punish people or some people who freely use the internet. So we have the problem here that on paper this country, you know, looks perfect, but when you go in real life, then there is a lot of fear. And I tried to address this fear in my letter to President, which has been published in various global media platforms yesterday, the day before yesterday, and it's continuing today. And my point is that we have to think about what to do with countries, not just think about countries where, you know, extreme cases like, I don't know, North Korea, Iran, where basically you cannot do really much. I mean, I don't know what can be done there. But cases like Azerbaijan, it's interesting because this country, this government, made itself acceptable and tolerable in the Council of Europe. So we are talking here already about some sort of, you know, accepted European standard of autocracy. And we are talking here about the possibility of this autocracy going global, exactly as this government didn't stop being corrupt here. It went corrupt globally. You know, I was watching the World Box Championship when Azerbaijani boxer was knocked down 6 times, and then the referee gave him the victory, you know, and BBC wrote about this corruption case, actually, and the things that go on there 10 months ago, before this championship, but it didn't prevent the government, you know, still to bribe the referee, you know. That was amazing. I mean, I really have respect to consistency of our government to go global about corruption. So recently was very interesting case in Mexico City. You think, what has Mexico City to do with Azerbaijan, you know? And you have amazing scene there. The Central Park, in one of the central parks in Mexico City, having Martin Luther King, statue to Martin Luther King. Then you have statue to Mahatma Gandhi. And next to it, you have statue to ex-KGB general, one of leaders of Soviet Union, member of Politburo, an ex-president of Azerbaijan, ex-authoritarian leader, father of the current president, his statue next to Martin Luther King and Gandhi. That cost our government $5 million to renovate the park and put the statue. The Mexicans are confused, and there is more media coverage about it. It's very amusing. So what I'm trying to say is that case with when you have a government which is so consistent and so stubborn about really exporting its own vision and its own standards around the world, I think we should really think about that this standard can, at the end of the day, become accepted global standard of autocracy 2.0. And in my opinion, it's more dangerous than countries like North Korea because they are not attractive. I mean, you already have frameworks like you wouldn't allow you to deal with them. You know, when governments, they kill people in thousands and hundreds, you know, doesn't matter what kind of security interests you have. You know, U.S. had to pull to leave Uzbekistan after the Uzbekistan presidents killed 500 people on the streets, even if they had a great security interest, you know, to stay there. So you don't need to do that. This is a nice autocracy. It's autocracy 2.0, and it can really export itself. It can clone itself. A lot of other countries which don't know which way to go can find this model attractive, you know. It's really cool. So my case is in the European Court of Human Rights, you know, and it's going to be decided, you know, was the state right to imprison me, or did they really violate my rights? You know, I'm out of jail. still no decision. And the decision, there was this journalist, Enel Fatulayev, who was sentenced for 8 years. He was released after decision of European Court of Human Rights in 4 years. And the punishment was that European Court decided that government should pay 28,000 euros to this journalist for being unjustly, illegally imprisoned and spending in jail for years. I can imagine looking at the faces of our, government leaders paying this 28,000, euros, and basically laughing probably, that if this is a price for us to go global, on European level and then global, and then really sell this as a model, as the way to live and exist, then I think here is something wrong, and I think that we should pay more attention to, I call it uninteresting story, because Azerbaijan is not extremely bad and it's not extremely good. It's average, if you take the world autocracies. So it can become a model, and once it gets accepted and tolerated, then I think we can start having real problems. So my question to the audience is, what can be done actually about this new phenomenon of autocracy 2.0? What can be done about countries who are not extremely bad, but are actually representing not a good example for other countries, to follow and to develop internet freedom and human rights policies? Thank you.
Thank you, and also for introducing a new concept of autocracy 2.0. Never heard that before. It's certainly an interesting testimony and much food for thought. Could you, Nicola, give the microphone to our last listed speaker, Teresa Swinehart from Verizon, please?
Thank you. Oh. I think that's working okay? Yes, fantastic. It's a very unique environment to try to talk. First, my apologies for having to step out briefly and for having missed parts of the earlier discussion. When I was first asked to join for this session, I was struggling a little bit to think about what to say, and then I started to read and sit on the plane and talk to people and various other things, and I was really struck by the fact that the internet and human rights and the shared values are actually much stronger than I had actually thought about in the past. In part, the shared values of how the internet was formed, which was touched upon earlier, the areas around transparency, the fact that the internet system and the decentralized nature by itself creates a checks and balances mechanism. There's transparency in how things are functioning, how the networks are functioning, how where the servers are, things of that sort, and this checks and balances also enables that there's workarounds when there's barriers to situations. And I think what's been clear and noticeable is that barriers don't scale at this point, and that efforts to create barriers have found workarounds, and the decentralized nature of the internet itself has likewise done that. The other things that I just want to throw into the discussion itself would be that the value of the internet and what it's done to not only provide services and opportunities to users worldwide, but actually become a mechanism to better enable the protection of human rights, the awareness and the ability to communicate more rapidly when there are human rights violations occurring, and get that out to a wider audience through the medium I think we've all seen over the past times. I remember prior to, in my former life, when I was doing some human rights work and the atrocities in Rwanda were occurring, it was through a telephone communication that we received notifications in the human rights organization I was working at. Today we get a tweet, or we get a video clipping, or we get something else. So I think it's a quite powerful medium. So it provides both opportunities for services and consumers, but it also provides a way for awareness around issues or atrocities. But I think there's also another factor. I know here we're touching on civil and political rights primarily in this discussion, but we also have economic, social, and cultural rights. And the internet itself has become quite an enabler in this space. And the more we enable and allow for investment in innovation and opportunities, the more we can also contribute towards the economic, social, and cultural rights opportunities, whether it's e-health or education or other initiatives. And these are also enabling forces. And there's clearly roles that are shifting with responsibilities. It was touched upon with service providers earlier. And so I think the important dialogue that needs to occur now is how to ensure that we don't unintentionally pull in the wrong players to have responsibilities for issues that we would not have done in the offline world. And I think that's an important dialogue to be having, because with that we can also ensure that we retain the rights and responsibilities in the right locations and allow the internet to continue to be a model not just for our own economic growth, but also for the protection of rights and the enabling of rights.
Yes, we also had a remote panelist, and I see our remote moderators putting up their signs. Is it our remote panelist from Bujumbura, or do you have other remote questions? Microphone.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah. So we have a remote participant from the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. His name is Philipp Mirti, and he would like to know from the panel what could be the best method to connect the internet and the human rights with a multi-stakeholder approach. And does the panel think that the focus should be on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that is supervised by the Human Rights Council, rather than being on the Intergovernmental Human Rights Committee, which does not have a notable non-state component?
A very specialized question. Is there anything else from the remote front?
No, nothing else.
Do we have contact with Jean-Paul Nkurunziza? He was listed as a remote panelist.
He's actually not online.
Okay, but I thought he had sent in some something in right. Well, anyway, I'll leave you to sort that out.
Thank you.
And I wonder, are there any other questions? So Lee was actually sort of trying to jump in on something, and I wonder also whether you would like to comment on a little bit on the role of the Council of Europe and the Court of Human Rights. Microphone for Lee.
I think that just building on what Teresa said, is that in terms of responsibilities for protecting and preserving the open architecture of the internet, equally in a way, human rights on the internet, governments have a role, but companies have a role. That's becoming more and more clear, evident. Users have a role. We all have a role. It's a shared space. We keep saying that. But we all, at the same time, have limited capacities to do things. I mean, I don't think it's feasible to think that a country, a government, can guarantee all human rights of all citizens in their country at all times. There's just too many things happening. So they have to make their best efforts, of course, but in all of the work over the last years in the Council of Europe, it's been about a shared approach with companies and with users, for that matter, and other communities. And so it's becoming very clear that we all have roles and we all have responsibilities, and we have to do best efforts to make sure that we do things together, and that we understand that we can't shirk those responsibilities. Now, okay, it's up to a state to go before the European Court of Human Rights, of course. It's not a company. It's not it can be an individual, of course, seeking that right. But it's very clear that states will have to work with companies more and more and more, much more regularly, I believe, to ensure that we have the freedom and we understand the nuances, that decisions are made by the courts and decisions are made in policy and regarding, future work together, whatever, with principles, global principles, etc., much more closely. If we're really going to, openly, transparently, inclusively protect the internet, preserve its functioning, make it ongoing, but do no harm to the internet, do no transboundary harm. I don't think we're quite there yet in making sure that those best efforts of all those actors are there. leaders talk about rules for the road, state-to-state responsibilities. Those are things to come. So I think those responsibilities include preserving the architecture of the internet as a major catalyst for human rights exercise of your rights and freedoms. I mean, the duality, as we said, is it's disappearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Just as an idea, when as an academic one looks at a model, there are a couple of parameters that one would want in any system, because first you would want to identify a problem statement, and you would also want to understand what is it that we're trying to fix and how then do we best go about it. In any format, especially one that's looking to address the internet, because the speed of development and the challenges, as a lot of our panelists and discussants have already mentioned, are far more, and they're far more faster to get any intergovernmental body to react, not just to the specific problem statement, but because we're having this conversation clearly in the light of the debate between the new ITRs that are being written and the concept of the impending Wicked Conference and the ITU. It is important to always remember, if we're not part of that discussion, if it's not truly multi-stakeholder, and if it is not inclusive, if I'm not in the room where I would be heard, or if I'm not part of the most crucial meetings where our future is going to be written and decided, and I do not have either access or recourse, I would be deeply disconcerted and extremely uncomfortable being part of such a process or supporting such a process as a mechanism for control. So one, I need to find out what's broken and what is it that we're trying to fix here. And second, these are issues when we're looking at either cybersecurity or when we're looking at enhanced regional cooperation. A lot of that is about trust, and that trust does not come through in remote locations in Geneva. That trust comes through a lot of governments sitting together and spending time. So a lot of bilaterals, a lot of issues at a local level. I've sort of found that's because India is unique in its problem statements, and we've been able to do this right because we've looked at issues locally. So that's just my concern there. When I'm looking at an intergovernmental body which does not have scope for any possibility of multi-stakeholder engagement, I would come back very, very uncomfortable. Thank you.
Thank you. That is, I think, what I sense is sort of a key notion among participants in the IGF, that whatever we do going forward, it needs to be in a multi-stakeholder mode. And this is basically also what is enshrined in the Tunis agenda. If this is part of internet governance has to be done in an open, transparent fashion in a multi-stakeholder mode. Now, unfortunately, the traditional bodies such as the Human Rights Council is anything but. I had the privilege of attending last February's session, which was a discussion on the internet, and I was one, I think, of 4 non-governmental speakers, and I think in the end only 3 were able to speak because there was not enough time. But it was government after government after government, and the general tone of the discussion, I can assure you, is slightly different than it is here. There was lots of talk on responsibility and far less on freedom of expression. Anyway, we have a great participation here, and I think I would like to hear from others as well. Yes, please. There are 2 gentlemen. Nick, or can you? He was first, so can you go to the back of the room? And please introduce yourselves when you speak so that we know who you are.
Hello, my name is Margiono. I'm the director of Indonesia Online Advocacy, an NGO newly founded in Indonesia. Regarding the censorship, before internet era, we only recognize one censorship, and that is governmental censorship. But during internet era, we now have private censorship, intellectual property-based censorship, but also in some country, also there is censorship by society. For example, in Indonesia, someone is jailed after writing a Facebook status saying that the God does not exist, and the people attack him physically, and then bring him to police, and then he brought to jail for 2.5 years. The government at the beginning didn't censor him, but the society his Facebook friend who did that. The minority is ensured by majority and non-democratic society. LGBT, for example, if you, like in Indonesia, where majority of Indonesian society is conservative Muslim, if you say something about LGBT, advocating the right of LGBT, the majority will silence you, giving offensive comment, bully you. So I think during the internet enable us to speak. Internet is like microphone, make us speak, make us hear, but the society also try to silence us. Not only the government, not only the companies, but also in the society. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an interesting testimony, but it is very much what we always say, and we see there will be more and more people coming online, and the 4 billion who are not online yet are usually in the developing world with different societal and cultural values, also religious values, and these then come to the fore. And obviously with the internet everything happens at the same time, and it does become also known to the outside world, and governments find it difficult to cope with that, and to societies as well. There was the gentleman with the blue t-shirt there. You got the microphone? Yes.
My name is Ahmed Badawi. Can you hear me? I am a political activist from Egypt. I see that the countries that are undergoing political transition to democracy, like Egypt, Tunis, and Libya, have a great opportunity to take internet as a human right as a serious thing. But you know that the old legislation, the old laws are still there as the same as is. The old laws from the old regimes, and new governments would see like, okay, we are after resolution, but at the same time these laws are benefiting them. Like if the government sees that this laws is good for them to control everything and to stay in power, how can we encourage them to go for more openness, for take internet as a human rights? How can we encourage them to do this? This is my question. Thank you.
I don't have the answer to your question, which is a good question. Does anyone have the answer to the question? Well, can we also listen from the room a little bit? Or are there other questions? I mean, can we think about the question? But anyway, I mean, Egypt has... Okay, Joy has an answer. Egypt has proved that the internet is a formidable agent of change. Anyway, Joy, please.
Thank you. I'm not sure I got the answer, but I have a response anyway. And it picks up on a point also that Emin made. And I think, you know, one thing I've heard a lot of in this IGF is that sort of we have the same rights online that we have offline. And this fundamental idea of, albeit that it may be a short-lived duality, as Lee mentions, that our rights apply online. But I think the point that's being raised in the discussion is that the context in which those rights are exercised offline also affects their experience online. So that if one is in, you know, repressive regimes which are using sort of autocracy 2.0 tactics to silence and create chilling effects, then we won't see the power of the internet realized. And I was at a meeting at Highway Africa recently where, you know, some of the African activists were saying we haven't actually seen the Arab Spring, to call it that, replicated across the world. We haven't. And why haven't we? And it's because, in part, that, you know, autocratic regimes are now alive to and aware of the ways in which the internet is being used in a variety of democratic movements, and are actively engaged in technical responses to resist that, both online and offline. So I think part of the answer to those questions is that we must actually connect our offline human rights activism and concerns about the rule of law and democracy and rights violations with our dialogue on internet rights, and with our dialogue on the technical, you know, the profound policy implications of interference with the technical protocols on which the internet is based. So in response to Maria's question, for example, can business prioritise certain packets of data? I guess the question is, it depends which packets. And therein, as soon as we begin to discriminate, we have human rights issues will inevitably arise. So I just wanted to respond to the remote participant, because I think there was an excellent question in relation to the Human Rights Committee, because they're quite right, quite correct that the Human Rights Committee is actually more multi-stakeholder than the Human Rights Council, because there are independent experts who are appointed, who are academics, who are from different fields. It's not as multi-stakeholder as the IGF, but I think it's an interesting and well-made point that there may be other places than the Human Rights Council to pursue this. Finally, I'd just say that the Azerbaijan government was one of the governments which affirmed or signed on to the Human Rights Council resolution that the same human rights we have offline apply online. And one of the questions that's being asked in the Human Rights Roundtable tomorrow morning is, what are the implications of that resolution for the IGF? For example, should the IGF be looking to input something back to the Human Rights Council or others that are answering this question from our multi-stakeholder discussions? I think it's an interesting idea, and perhaps one that we might want to get thoughts about.
Thank you for that. The IGF as such would be rather difficult to give a message back, but there can be a message coming out of the IGF, and that roundtable is an event that is taking place in the framework of the IGF, and that is certainly worthwhile thinking to have some message out of that on this important issue, and as there are so many workshops on human rights, it's certainly something worth thinking about. Other comments? You would like to say? Yes, Ruby, please.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more with you. We recently had a bit of a controversy. This was about a book of political science that's taught to students of 10+2 standards, secondary school. It had a small cartoon which was drawn about 40 years ago of an important leader who represented a particular community and is considered to be the father of the Indian Constitution. We had him on a snail, and we had Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, and there was a whip at the back. And we were trying to say, because Indian Constitution has been one of the most expansive ones, the process of drafting the Constitution was a little slow. This book was in circulation for about 6 years. The cartoon was about 40 years old. Somebody picked up the cartoon, circulated it over the internet. This was then telecast live across several state public service broadcasting channels. For the first time, what this managed to do was, one, draw the attention of parliamentarians to actually look at textbooks in India for the first time, and second, you had consensus across all party lines. It has never happened on any issue, saying that because and this is the election year, we're very close, so a certain community for vote banks should not be offended. And I couldn't agree more with Joy when she says that offline activism has to support online activism, because we're clearly looking at the strength of weak ties. So you can vent and you can express your feelings whatever and however much you would like to. So one of the things that we did was to go to a professor who was part of the committee, and this was part of the Ministry of HRD, the Human Resource Ministry. So this was a government textbook, and you had the government taking a stand against the textbook, and you had everyone coming together. So we went to student communities and we got engaged with them, and then we built mobility and opinion that this possibly cannot happen. I think human rights and the right to be read, and what was also happening was the right of academics to teach what they would like to teach. And this was extremely well drafted as a process. But there's always this danger that governments will cut off their nose to spite the face. Even if they have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, they will do it. But so aligning as a community and taking this forward offline and getting mainstream media to also support online activism becomes very, very crucial. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Other comments? Would you like? Yes, Nicola?
Yeah, just a question. I mean, I think we've heard already that there is an interesting parallel in the way that, I mean, the internet is really about empowerment, and then can we consider that the way that governments deal with technology reflects the way they deal with empowerment in the offline world? So is there, you know, a mirror in the way governments use technology and deal with it by the way they deal with people's empowerment offline? So that is maybe a question for panels.
It's an interesting question. It's also a question. Governments, I think, on the whole, are always a step back when it comes to technology, if not two. The technologists are ahead and the governments are usually late in adapting, but I don't know whether anybody has an answer or comments. Other comments, questions? If not, then I would like to give the opportunity to our panelists to make class. Would you like to say, please?
Only, I mean, if we're at that last moment. Yes, thank you. This is Aubrey speaking. I actually found the discussion interesting and at times disturbing. I think that the minimum that I sort of expect from governments is to help uphold the rights, so that when I hear of Indonesia, I guess it was Indonesia, or whatever government it may be, not protecting an LGBT comment from a crowd, but actually imprisoning the person to be something. When you say, who can do something about it, I'm not really sure. And it's one of those problems where, you know, you expect the government to behave better. You expect the people, as we saw in the Arab Spring, to be, when the people are out in the street, they're trying to convince their government to behave better, not to behave worse. One of the things that come up, and I think that this comes back to the stemming from the paper, is that the internet is really meant to be a force for knowledge, a force for freedoms, a force for human rights. Yet, in developing technology, we often develop technology that has the ability to impact favorably or the ability to impact negatively. And I guess in that kind of case, I sort of expect it to be incumbent on the businesses that make a lot of money from technology to not make a lot of money on selling it to those who would use it to impact negatively. And that's when you start getting to multi-stakeholder responsibilities, and each of us having responsibilities within our own role. As a technologist, when I'm wearing that hat, I need to be very careful that I don't create technology. In fact, just to step back to an almost anecdotal, I was reading a document that I had written years ago, and it was a routing document, and I had talked about a requirement to be able to trace every packet from where it came from. And that I thought was important so that we could maintain the system. In reading it later, it all of a sudden occurred to me, and it makes it possible for a government to trace what everyone says. And so I think the last thing I'd like to say is that when we are creating technology, either in terms of creating protocols or in terms of creating and selling products, we need to measure the impact of what we are doing and take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. Maria, would you have a few words?
Yeah, thank you very much. I actually got a lot of thoughts by listening to all of you. Very, very interesting perspectives. I'm not sure actually I really got your question right, but as I understand it, it's like if the governments are further ahead with the technology, that would actually make them have better tools to surveillance, or I didn't get your questions really, I'm sorry.
No, what I meant is that, I mean, across the world you see different governments in the offline world. they deal differently with people's empowerment. You know, offline freedoms are not the same in different countries. And my reflection was about, is the way they consider users' freedoms offline reflected in the way they tackle technology online? So, but you don't have to respond necessarily, but that was a thought.
Yeah, that's okay. I get it. I think it's a bit of a tricky question. I'm going to twist it a little bit by saying that in many cases, well, in some cases at least, it has to do with governments not being maybe behind or slow, like Marcus was saying, but maybe that as well actually. But more like they don't always understand how internet works. So maybe even in some cases it might, and I'm not saying to violate the human rights here, I'm talking about other ways that it could be like stopping criminal activities or something like that in other senses. Then they don't always use the most efficient tools to do that. For instance, the roles of the intermediaries. I mean, I can just give a little anecdote. So this was it was a few years ago, but I was talking to one of my colleagues at the Ministry of Justice, and because we were talking about, well, he is on the police side of the government, and he said, well, of course we have to. The operators need to do something and need to cooperate, and the operators are. I said, but what do you mean with an operator? Yeah, but are they more than one operator? So I mean, internet has a lot of layers, and all those layers are owned and had different responsibilities, and there are different parties. So in many cases, actually, it has to do with the governments not really understanding how internet works, and that's one of the roles well, maybe I put myself into that role, but I'm trying to spread the word how internet really works. In my government, together with my dear colleagues outside the government, of course, in a true multi-stakeholder way, of course. But well, anyway, so that. However, I would like to say, of course, having really high knowledge about how technology works also could be used in a bad way, to actually use all this fantastic technology actually to trace people and so on. So it's kind of both ways. Thank you.
Thank you. Just noticed I've been extremely bad at time management, and I don't think I'll be able to give to all our speakers an opportunity for a last word. But I think, well, your remarks I think were very pertinent, and also what Avri said. And I think if governments behave badly offline, they will also behave badly online. And that is an answer to Nicola's question. If governments are enlightened offline, then I presume they will also be enlightened online. There may be some glitches that, as Maria said, they don't understand the technology properly, or they don't understand the unintended consequences, and they have what we like to call knee-jerk reactions. We have a problem, okay, let's deal with it. I remember the London riots last year, when there were some politicians who said, oh, shut down Facebook, or that's a knee-jerk reaction to a problem which should not happen in a democratic government. But the example cited by our Indonesian colleague, I think because the Indonesian government presumably would do the same thing offline, they do that also when it happens online. But because it is online, everybody knows about it, and that is the difference. A lot of these human rights violations happened, but they were less known because they were more behind closed doors. Now with the internet, it opens a big wide window, and everybody knows everything almost instantly, and that is also a big opportunity. Yes, we have to understand there are different societal traditions, but at the same time, I think collectively we do believe in the shared values of human rights, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been signed by all the member states of the United Nations, and I think this is something we should never forget. I just wonder, as we are in Azerbaijan, whether we should give the last word to our journalist from Azerbaijan, lessons learned from this IGF and next steps, please. But you have to be very short.
No, actually, I would like to thank you for actually holding this IGF event in Azerbaijan, and I think that you are planning to hold it next year in Indonesia. I think because there is criticism, let's say Amnesty International was criticizing IGF or organizers, do we have to hold events like this in authoritarian countries? I think it depends, because there are different levels of authoritarianism and different, bad human rights. It can be bad, it can be very bad, it can be extremely bad, and it can be unacceptable. So I think that it's good to hold AGF in these countries. I would even insist that you keep on holding this in authoritarian countries, because in America, I don't know, in Europe, you have already, a lot of platforms where people can come and speak and discuss these things. But in many countries of the world, like Google organized this big tent event debate between independent blogger and pro-governmental blogger. That was doesn't happen here every day. I don't remember when I was last at some event like this in this country. So that's why I want to thank you, and I kind of partly I can say that repeat my request to write about it, about autocracy 2.0 cases, and take it to academia, because once you take it there, I think we have much wider platform and about thinking about solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this. This was excellent concluding remarks, and I would like to thank you, because this is indeed one of the questions which is in forefront of many people's minds. And to know from somebody who is directly concerned that this is seen as positive to come into this country for the IGF is, I think, good for us to know. With that, I would like to thank all the speakers, all the panelists, and all the participants who listened to us so patiently. Many thanks, and I would like to invite you to join us. Give me a hand to the speakers, please.